We are here to talk about pipeline analytics and specifically vanity versus value. I'm sure we've all seen some of those vanity metrics that maybe we have loved to track, or some other leaders on our team have loved to track, that actually don't do anything for you, and then have all probably experienced the aha moment of actually measuring and tracking the right things and the impact that that can have. So we're going to be diving into that topic today, and I've got a couple of experts with me that are going to be leading the charge and diving into some of that content. So I have Albert Wong, who is on the RevOps team over at Clay, and I have Daniel Ruiz, who is the founder of Sync. And Daniel, I'm going to turn it over to you for content, but before I do, I have just one non-RevOps, non-work related question for you guys that I want to surprise you with. And I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this before, but I want to get some off the cuff answers. Daniel, Albert's our guest here, so I'm obviously going to ask you first so that he at least has a little bit of lead time to come up with his answers. As you guys know, we are hosting our annual RevOps conference, RevOps AF, in New Orleans in May. We're going to have 300 to 350 operators there from all over the globe. We've had people buy tickets from Argentina. Someone from New Zealand bought a ticket the other day, and operators from companies like Cisco, Zoom, Boeing, and a bunch of other SMB and mid-market companies are going to be there. So, Daniel, I want you to imagine that you are the opening keynote speaker for RevOps AF in New Orleans in May. We have 350 people in the audience, right? We call your name. Everyone starts chanting your name as you come up on stage. What would be the walk-up song that you would play as you came up on stage to deliver the opening keynote for RevOps AF?
Oh man, I'm so unhappy you asked me this before.
There's no wrong answer.
Let's go Highway to Hell, AC/DC.
Nice. Very good choice. We have had some classic rock answers before, Metallica. I've also had some crazy answers, like someone brought up a Beethoven, like not song, I don't know, symphony, something. So like I said, no wrong answers. All right, Albert, we've got Highway to Hell, AC/DC. What sort of vibe are you bringing as you come up on stage to deliver the opening keynote at RevOps AF?
Ooh, that's a hard one. I mean, I might just go with one of my go-to karaoke songs, which is Don't Stop Believing by Journey.
All right, that's a good choice. And you brought up karaoke. We are going to have our after party at the conference at the House of Blues, and we will have a karaoke stage. So I don't know, Albert, if you're available. I'm already talking to Mustafa on your team about getting you guys involved in the conference. So just saying, karaoke RevOps, I mean, is there anything better? And then also the last thing I'll mention for everyone, Daniel, before I turn it over to you, is we are going to be having, for folks in Europe or EMEA, we are going to be having a RevOps AF EMEA event in Berlin in June. I'll throw the links here in the chat so that you all can check it out. Would obviously love to have you all there. But with that, Daniel, why don't you go ahead and pull up the slides and visuals that you have and get us kicked off on this whole vanity versus value discussion around pipeline analytics.
Thank you, Matt. Can everyone see the slides?
Yes.
Thank you. Again, thank you for Matt for hosting, Albert for joining. We're going to be talking about everything related to pipeline analytics today. Vanity versus value, what matters, what doesn't, what your team wastes time on, what they should be spending more time on, and everything under the sun there. So just a quick agenda. What is this? Why does it matter? What are the things you want to avoid? What are the pitfalls? What are the things you actually want to spend time on? What do you want to track? And then we'll leave some time at the end for a relatively short Q&A. So please, as we go through, either feel free to throw questions in the Zoom chat right away or hold them till the end. Sweet. So Matt already mentioned this. I'm the founder of Cinch. Albert helps lead RevOps over at Clay. Albert, any context you want to give on your background or anything you think is extra important to highlight?
I've been doing this for about 6-7 years now. Helped founded the BizOps function at Blend and also RevOps at Captivate IQ and led RevOps at Alloy before joining Clay here.
Albert is incredibly humble. Part of the reason I asked Albert to do this with me today is because I think he is the smartest RevOps individual that I know. Even if he sounds understated when he gives his background. I can promise it is very, very, very impressive. There's your kudos for the day, Albert.
Far too kind.
Sweet. Does this matter? Albert, feel free to jump in wherever you want. You're going to be much more detailed here than me. This was a slide that you had created. Why does pipeline analytics matter? People hear what they want to hear. People want to present themselves in the best light. Data is only as good as what you're monitoring it against. If you're not careful, you can very easily end up with false positives, dulling the company's ability to react to changes in that data.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important because the fact is everyone fundamentally they want to put themselves in a good light. And I would say one of the key responsibilities of RevOps is being that objective voice, being that objective person who presents things for the good and for the bad. And sure, when things are good, it's important to celebrate them. But alternatively, if things are actually turning bad, it's also important to highlight them to make sure you start patching things up and fixing things before the situation gets more dire.
Albert, any stories from your past here that you might think would be illustrative of maybe things that went wrong or could have been done better? If not, I will not put you on the spot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been in situations where I would describe it as the team responsible for the metric were grading their own report cards. The company had those teams in a silo pretty much say, hey, this is what we should be graded on, and these are the metrics. And that's pretty dangerous because guess what? You're always probably going to end up having some inflated metrics that makes them look as good as possible.
If I had been able to grade my own physics papers in college, I would have ended up with a much better score in those classes.
Yeah, I probably would have ended up with a higher GPA.
So what are some things to avoid? Albert mentioned some of these here, but again, you want to make sure that the team being measured does not set their own measuring stick. You can think of this as a separation of church and state between RevOps and the revenue team, maybe. You don't want to be too focused on metrics that don't hold water. So if you're looking at something just complete top of funnel, how many leads are we getting in a given month? Chances are that's actually not the best metric that's going to influence your company's bottom line. Don't use the bull case if you know you're going to be discounting a bunch to win deals. If you know that the customer segment you're selling into now is actually going to be at a much lower ASP than normal, don't just think that your 25K deals are going to stay 25K deals forever. And then again, kind of the same two fall into the top bucket, but metrics that can't really be explained about how it actually moves the needle for the business and kind of the North Star of where you want to go this year. And then misalignment between goals and incentives.
Yeah, I think the one thing is it's super important to have a clearly defined company dictionary. So for any sort of metric, anything, you need to make sure where you round everyone up and pretty much start setting it. So, hey, this is the exact definition of this metric. This is the exact definition of this classification or something like that. If you don't have that down, then everyone is kind of talking over each other.
So we can run through a hypothetical scenario here. You're sitting in a meeting with your executive team. They're kind of reviewing last quarter's numbers, and going into next quarter, you were able to generate $10 million in pipeline. Everyone is so excited. Everyone is high-fiving. The marketing team is hooting and hollering. But do these numbers actually hold water? And is this something that you should be excited about? So we have a nice little picture here. This is about the extent of my Photoshop and image making abilities. So you can see again, kind of the $10 million is above the iceberg. This is great. But to Albert's point on the last side, there's a bunch of questions you then need to be asking yourself about that pipeline that can hopefully point out the pitfalls before you get there. So have you ever closed a company this size before? Have you ever won a deal without discounting? Are you moving into a new vertical that you don't have experience and historical win rates to actually track against? All of those types of things are kind of the next level questions you should be thinking through to actually figure out how much of this business you can kind of actually expect to close. Anything you want to add there, Albert, besides making fun of my Photoshop?
It's far better than what I could do, but I think it's exactly sort of what you described. There's a million ways to sort of get to this number. I mean, quite frankly, most of us are just reporting pipeline from a CRM instance, whether it's like Salesforce or HubSpot or something like that. And I could easily create a fake $10 million in pipeline just by going to the op and upping the number. But aside from that, there's a bunch of different things to sort of consider, such as the fact, hey, is there one particular deal that represents a disproportionate amount of this pipeline? And what are the backup cases if that sort of falls through? What if this like $10 million pipeline, 3 million of it comes from a Google or a JP Morgan or something like that? That's one piece. And also, I've seen it at companies before, kind of how you alluded to it. They try to put in the initial values as whatever sticker price is when they've never sold anything at sticker price, which just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. The other thing I've experienced before is putting together the board deck, for example, quarterly board deck, right? You pull data from your CRM, you make a lot of these considerations, right? You put all the numbers together, you send them to the VP of sales, and then VP of sales comes back and is like, oh no, like this deal, that deal aren't in here. This deal should be more, right? It's like, oh, there's all this magically, all of a sudden, there's all this stuff outside of what's in our CRM or what our CRM says, right? That is like needs to be presented to the board. So going back to some of the stuff we talked about before, it's, one, it's human nature to want to present a best case, right? Sort of scenario. But the job of an operator is to make sure that you're grounded and based in reality and that you're able to tell the right type of story.
Yeah, it's kind of funny you put it that way. I would describe it as most of the time there's enough optimists in the company. So I'm there to present as the counterweight to them, where maybe it's a pessimist view or maybe just a more realistic view, because even if I present the pessimist view, it gets counterbalanced by them. So we eventually land somewhere in the middle.
This is why me and you balance each other out well, Albert. And yeah, on your point on discounting, the sales rep had their discovery call, gave them the sticker price, and he or she, is really swearing that there's not any budgetary concerns. But again, if you've never sold a deal without discounting in your company's history, it's probably not the time to be trusting that AE or that SDR about kind of where that deal is going to come in from an amount perspective.
Yeah. Happy years are a thing.
Sweet. So this is, to Albert's point, I think a very simple example of what could theoretically be a vanity metric here. So if we're, sitting in that quarterly business review, talking about some of our initiatives for Q1, Q2, and this company actually decided, at the beginning of Q2, they were going to make a big marketing push, invest in a bunch of ad spend, et cetera. And they're all really, really excited because they're having a ton of new opportunities get created, looking at Q2 and the beginning of Q3 relative to where they were at Q1. If you walked away from that with that being kind of the only data point you're tracking, you're going to miss some stuff that could theoretically be pointing to a much larger problem kind of in the business, and also maybe showing that the marketing spend might not be worth it. So you can see that as the number of opportunities are getting created in Q2, the qualification rate of those are dropping significantly. Albert, anything you want to add there? And even maybe, I think there's like 7 other layers of depth you could go to here.
Yeah, I think the couple of things about it is effectively most of the metrics that people talk about, such as leads, opportunities, they are fundamentally right. But what you really need to do is essentially define criterias of qualification. Like you need essentially what really, really matters is after you actually cross that gate to qualification is one piece. And then the next piece, I would describe them as you can sort of measure for how the changes are over time as you implement in new initiatives and stuff like that. Do those metrics that you had before still hold water?
Yeah, the other, I just want to
So
add one other thing Albert mentioned before about having a clear data dictionary or kind of common definitions. I think that's another piece that's really important around pipeline, especially when you think about pipeline creation and the qualification stuff we were just talking about, but also the different stages. So I think it's like one place where you can get into trouble again around vanity versus value. If you don't have those common definitions and if you don't have clear entry and exit criteria for each particular stage, then you can wind up in a spot where a lot of this is not really qualified pipe yet. And so, yeah, clear definitions for qualification is super important so that when someone says X dollars of pipeline, right, you all know that you're talking about the same thing. And then kind of clear entry and exit criteria for those things as they move throughout your pipe. Because again, otherwise you're going to get into a lot of problems. And actually, this is one of those things I've seen before, even when we've talked about like win rates, for example. Uh, like I've seen companies before that have said like, oh, well, our win rate is X, right? 65%. I'm like, wow, that's incredible, right? And they're like, yeah, it's like we measure win rate based on deals that reach proposal stage or something. And it's like, oh, okay. Well, yeah, I would hope that when you get to proposal with most of your deals that you're actually closing most of those, right? So again, you can, try to portray the best, most positive, kind of light with some of these things. But the common definitions, super, super important. I think that's probably one thing that, everyone can go out and like do today, right? If you don't have those things in place, it can be as simple as like a Google Doc, a spreadsheet, a Notion page, right? Like start documenting those things and get people to like sign off and agree because that can save you a lot of headache in the future.
Yeah, really good point there. Something along those lines. Win rate is one of those things that can very easily be spoofed depending on how you do it. For a couple of the orgs I've been at, I would say they could easily say, hey, when Albert joined, there was a sudden drop in win rate. And part of that is because at the last couple of companies I've been at, I've jokingly said, I've closed more opportunities than anyone else in the company, actually more than everyone combined. Unfortunately, it didn't bring in a dollar. It's just because we had a bunch of opportunities that just forever stayed open and no one did anything about it. And how they were calculating win rate was essentially, oh, yeah, of the closed cohort of deals, it was just closed or it's just a win versus loss. But I'm like, wait, there's all these deals that just never closed even though they should have been lost.
Yep, the parking lot is very real. I've also seen actually when I've gone through that exercise before, Albert, of closing a bunch of deals as well. I mentioned the board deck stuff before. I have some prior scars of like heads of sales coming back and being like, oh no, we need to, again, it's quarterly board prep time, right? So like, no, we need to reopen opportunity X, Y, and Z because like I'm still trying to get in touch with them and like there's still a chance that like you deal there, right? And what you're really trying to do, again, we talk about someone brought up like win rate is almost always obfuscating the truth, right? Again, you look at kind of deals that you win over all the deals that you close, right? If you take closed deals out of that equation, you can produce a better metric that you can then present to the board. So there's a lot of things you can do there to try to finesse some of these things, right? So yeah, I think we've probably all got maybe some stories like that, but yeah, that one rang true when you mentioned Albert.
Yep.
So again, a bunch of questions here that you should be asking. There's 50 more than just the ones on this screen. And I don't want these questions to imply that, your business is entirely static and historical win rates are going to stay the same and you can't increase ASP and move up market or any of those things. But I think it's really important that if you're going to expect a trend to change from the historicals, you and your business leaders need to have a very good reason as to why that is going to change, as to why you're not going to have to discount as much this quarter relative to last, as to why you're going to be able to start closing ENT customers instead of just middle market customers. and being able to have those actual like business case assumptions be backed by either a product change or anything like that is more important than just, well, we've been around a while, we think we should be able to increase ASP.
Yeah, very, very true.
Sweet. So that was kind of the vanity section. Think of it as the don't section. Moving on to the more positives. What do we want to be tracking? What do we want to be thinking about? So this is all stuff that Albert has mentioned kind of in the previous slides, but things like qualified leads and qualified pipeline with really well-defined criteria for what qualification is, conversion rate over time, win rate over time, forecast accuracy, both on the team and the rep level are all some kind of the key points there. Albert, maybe you have another data point or an anecdote or anything around forecast accuracy?
I would very much say for forecast accuracy, it's very much what you sort of think. There is supposed to be sort of a expectation that you are getting closer and closer to the right mark as the quarter progresses along. And you do sort of study your historicals to understand just like, hey, at the beginning of the quarter, what is the potential delta of it? What I think the range is going to be, it's going to be like maybe up 25%, down 25% or something like that. Or is it going to be up 15%, up, down 15%? And the goal there is probably from quarter to quarter, get that band to narrow more and more as things progress. As for the other pieces or like conversion rate over time and stuff, win rate over time, I describe them as almost like the derivative values that tells you the quality of the high level values of your qualified leads and pipeline. I've seen things where it can go wayside for different reasons, such as qualified pipeline. I've seen that grow just because there was the pressure of by like the AE to accept a lead. In order to do so, they had to qualify it. So when things were getting worse, people were accepting things more loosely. So there's a bunch of different ways where that gets skewed. And it's super important to have those derivative values measured to understand, hey, is this thing still holding water or not?
I have a question for you around forecasting. This kind of goes to Mason's comment in the chat, which is in short, how in the hell are we still relying on manual forecast entries in 2025? So I've felt this way for a while around like how necessary is just even the forecasting exercise, like the manual one that we've all gone through in the past. Because again, if you understand your pipeline, your conversion rates, there's math that you can do to, right, probability weighted, all this stuff, right, without doing anything overcomplicated that can tell you like, hey, we've got X, right, of open pipe. That's probably going to produce Y. And we've gone kind of down this road of like getting the stuff that Mason said, right? All these forecast calls that we do every single week. And then we kind of do these forecast roll-ups, and then we, manually compare forecasts back to actuals, right? And I just think about like, what's the actual value of this? Like, are there actions that we can ever take based on what we learn or do with forecasting? Or is it just one of those things where it's kind of been like, oh, well, we've just always kind of done it this way, and so we're just going to continue to keep doing it this way? So I don't know how you feel about forecasting, but yeah, like, I don't know. How do you feel about that in today's day and age, 2025? And how should operators be looking at doing or not doing forecasting today?
So I would describe forecasting is fundamentally both a science and an art. There's one piece of the art portion where, okay, I think it's very, very hard to remove and make it all science. The biggest part of the art portion, I would describe it as your whale deals. These are just deals that maybe you have never seen before. They're very, very unique. They can be 2 years long. They are like with the Fortune 500 companies of the world. And if you've never encountered something like that, I don't know what scientific or what data points you're going to use to try to extrapolate that out. As for the other pieces, I would describe it as even here at Clay, we're constantly trying to refine that forecasting process. We're trying to make it so we can automate as much of it as possible. How we have things set here is we effectively have entry and exit requirements for different stages and those gates. What we're trying to do is automate and pull information from gong calls or emails and utilizing AI, be able to fill as much of that in as possible so it can go more smoothly through some of the initial stages and such. But aside from that, it also depends on the maturity of your business. If you're a business that's fast growing and pretty early on, you don't have years and years of data point. A lot of it is going to be a bit of a guessing, and that piece becomes sort of the art piece as well. So I think that's sort of where I land on why we are still having forecasting calls, because they are still somewhat necessary for companies still in development. If you are a long-standing company that's been around for like 20 years, sure, probably very, very different game. You have points to look at then.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I have two more questions for you on this forecasting topic. Sarah mentioned in the chat that a lot of these forecasting meetings are really centered around holding the reps accountable. And I agree with that. I do think there's value in that. But in your experience, are there other ways outside of call it a forecasting call to hold reps accountable, make sure they know the ins and outs of their deals, where they're at, right? Like, are there other options besides doing this forecasting exercise?
So for myself, I mean, we have this forecasting call to essentially set a operating rhythm for the company. But in terms of checking and making sure things are right, I actually don't lean towards the forecasting call to do that. I lean like that's helps set a cadence, but a lot of times going through the forecast and stuff is often done during sort of those one-on-ones between the manager and the rep, because the whole point there is not to embarrass them or something like that, but it is for forecasting calls from some of the best sales leaders I've worked with. It's meant to be sort of a opportunity to share and learn from each other and sort of understand what else is going in the pipeline, and potentially can they help each other out, as well as potentially a meeting where it becomes a hand raiser opportunity of just like, hey, I have this deal, and I actually think some things that are very helpful is maybe if one of our execs can reach out, or also like rep A is asking just like for the rest of the reps of just like, hey, have you encountered anything like this in one of your deals before? And that I'm currently hitting as a blocker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I guess the other thing I'll mention, then I'll turn it back over to you, Daniel, is I think with forecasting in particular, but also we're talking about pipeline analytics, right? Things to track. Typically, we all have some sort of operating plan that we're trying to march towards or execute against. And we can often wind up in a scenario where we start tracking all of these data points and never actually comparing it back against plan. And if we do that, though, then taking the next step of like, okay, well, what am I going to do about it? And so I think that's another thing I'll just mention for folks today that's important with forecasting specifically is like, ask yourself, are you actually looking at your actual results and comparing that back against forecasts to understand how well you're doing? If you're not doing that, then what's the point of doing a forecast? So like step number one, make sure you're actually like comparing actuals and forecasts. And then that's the other thing I always look at with metrics and analytics, like all the stuff we have here on the screen, right? Qualified leads, qualified pipeline, conversion rate. I always try to ask myself like, okay, what am I going to do with this information, right? Like what actions will I take based on what this data tells me? And if you can't come up with an action or something that you would do, then chances are it's probably in that vanity metric bucket and nothing that's actually adding value.
Yeah. And I think the one thing I would say that more art comes into play if the science isn't rigid enough. So if you're at a company that is, let's say only doing forecast probabilities based off opportunity stage, that's probably not rigid enough. If you have two deals in the same forecast category, but one of them hasn't changed opportunity stages in 3 weeks and has no emails, calls, or meetings with that prospect in the last 2 weeks, that should be weighted very differently than a deal that just moved into this stage and you've had 3 meetings with them over the last 7 days. And I think you need to have a robust enough, dynamic enough forecasting process and product to be able to account for those things and weight those deals differently. Okay, so this is a good example of ways you can dig even deeper here. We are looking at open pipeline by rep. We have a team of sales reps, different quotas. We're looking at pipe closing in this quarter as well as next, and seeing where each rep's kind of quota coverage expectation for this quarter is. That's what those black lines are. If you think about the pipeline that makes up each of these bar charts for a rep, 2 reps can have the exact same amount in their open pipe for a given quarter. But if the deals and the types of companies that make up that open pipe are very, very different, you want to be able to have the granularity to know that, because that's actually going to greatly affect that rep's chance of making quota, as well as your company's chances of actually closing any of those deals. Albert, anything you want to add there at a high level?
Yeah, I mean, exactly what you're saying. And I think one of the things is you don't have full control of it, but you do have some practices and potentially automations in place to help standardize a lot of it, as well as control to wipe out any sort of fake pipeline. At a lot of the orgs before, including Clay and where I've been at before, we have set cadences of just like, hey, if it hits a certain time period, this opportunity will get DQ'd or closed loss because there hasn't been any type of movement for it. So that helps reduce down some of the trash opportunities that might be cluttering your pipeline. So a lot of it looks a bit more real, because it's very much right now without anything in place. It's kind of trying to understand how individuals act like rep by rep. I have some reps who are pretty good about their CRM hygiene, and they will close it pretty promptly so they know what to work on next. And I have ones who just leave it open forever.
Yeah, if you don't have some of those automations built out, you can very easily stand up a dashboard for looking at something like, open pipeline by stage and kind of group it by close date. And if you're seeing a bunch of opportunities that are still open that currently have close dates expected in November and December of 2024, that can usually be a pretty good indicator to you and your team that there's a bunch of stale ops and kind of that open pipe number isn't exactly what you expect it to be.
Yep.
Sweet. Albert, you want to take this one?
I am a little far from being able to even see what's on a
All
market.
right. So we have some goals and outcomes here. This is really just a recap of a lot of the things that we've chatted about today that we think are important for businesses to be able to pull and stand up quickly. So you want to be able to look at detailed historical close rates across product lines, prospect info, company info, account owner on the rep side, and lead sources. You want to be able to have very detailed pricing information accounting for different seasonality to the type of company you're selling into, the specific SKU that they are talking about purchasing from your company. And you want to be able to have very detailed historical funnel performance accounting for prospect information, lead sources, et cetera. You should have very granular data around, for this type of company, how long does it take them to go from S1 to S2 to S3 on average? Once they hit S2 to S3, what's our expectation around a win rate for ops that have gone that far in our funnel? Sweet. So kind of the overarching thing that we have here today is more data does not automatically equal better data. Albert, Matt, and myself have all kind of talked about different data points we would track, different data sources we think are important to consider. But just because you have more data, it does not automatically mean it's going to be better data. Take in mind the context of your business, the context of your team, the context of your company's key business initiatives, and really think through, for the data that you're getting, what does it actually mean for your specific org?
Yeah, I mean, essentially one way of definition of more data is me just going into Salesforce and adding in a bunch more fields. That doesn't do anything else but in fact effectively piss off my reps and make them hate me. It has to be just like, hey, we are collecting this data for purposes that actually helps the business. We understand that it may be overhead on you. And as a ops partner, a lot of time what I'm looking to do is I do my best to try to do trade-offs. Essentially, hey, by trying to add this one piece of ask on you, I'll do my best to see if I can remove something off of your plate. And yeah, so there is this little bit of horse trading going on with that respect. But ultimately, the whole idea is trying to get more and more relevant metrics in to better measure the health of the business.
Yeah. That piece you just mentioned there, Albert, I think is super important for everyone here too, is communicate with your team on the why, right? Don't never assume that they'll know why
Yeah.
or understand why. And the more transparent you can be, the more trust that you'll build. But also, I always like, any opportunity to explain why we're doing something is another opportunity for you to learn, right? So one, you get better at communicating the why, the business reasons behind why these things are important. But you can also collect feedback from the rep or the person on the other side, learn things that you may not have known before. So yeah, the transparency piece there and just the communication piece, super, super important. I had, I guess, Albert, a couple questions for you. I want to start with the right things to track. So I know we looked at some analytics before, but like what are the things that are on the Clay dashboard that you look at on, say, a daily, weekly, monthly basis that your team looks at? What metrics are you looking at around pipeline every day to help drive business forward?
I think one is pacing is very, very important here. We're very much looking at just like, hey, how are we doing according to plan? Such as most of our like how we run the company today is heavily on sort of a quarterly cadence. So we had sort of expectations of within month one, we expect our velocity sales team to have hit this target, month two, this much, and then month three, it would be this much. How are we doing relative to that? And then aside from that, it is essentially how has pipeline been changing week over week? What's the sort of qualification rate? Has there been any sort of drop off? Has things maintained pretty healthy? Or has there been any anomaly events? Like certain things are obviously going to skew things left and right. We were quite blessed that we recently raised the round, and obviously with one of those announcements, you obviously get a huge flood of inbound. So those things do skew things a little bit left and right. But yeah, alternatively,
Mhm.
there's the downside stuff too.
Yeah. And then the flip side of that, and this doesn't need to be at Clay, but in your experience, you mentioned like, right, when Albert joins the company, win rates plummet because he goes in and cleans some things up. So what are maybe some examples of things that maybe you've seen on, call it, pipeline dashboards, that when you first joined companies that you've just like eliminated? Like, again, getting to some of the vanity stuff. Like, what are some of those things that might be on people's dashboards today that you're like, hey, this is just not right?
I think it is exactly what we kind of covered. It's moving from pipeline to something that's more real, which is like qualified pipeline. So essentially, we are only really classifying and recognizing what has actually been vetted. I mean, I've been to a org where when I went in, I discovered that one of the things they did when they set up Salesforce is they bought a giant list of accounts and they actually opened a new opportunity for every single account. And guess what? One of the first things I did is just like, Jesus, has been running 2, 3 years back. They're all not relevant. They're all dead. And I instantaneously wiped out millions of dollars of supposed pipeline in one go.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the systems side of this and maybe the technical aspect. So you mentioned one example, maybe a don't do this, of create opportunities for just say accounts you're going after. I think that sounds obvious, but let's not do that. What, in your experience, and I know this, the first answer here will be it depends. I know that. But what are some best practices around opportunity creation in your CRM and getting to that qualified pipeline number? Just so people here can understand maybe the trade-offs between different ways to set up your systems, right? In some cases, I've seen you leverage like the lead object, you do some of the discovery stuff there, convert to an opportunity, and then that stage zero is essentially like qualified pipe. So every opportunity that gets created is qualified pipeline. I've seen some cases where maybe you create the opportunity when the meeting gets booked, you go through some discovery to determine if there is a real opportunity there, if they meet, BANT or MEDPIC or whatever your methodology is. And then maybe it's like stage zero is that, right? And then stage one, the next stage is maybe when you consider it like qualified opportunity. What what has your experience been? Best practices, things that you recommend, and maybe just trade-offs, different approaches there.
I mean, the simple umbrella concepts are pretty much it's consistent and structured. Doesn't matter what sort of business it is, you need to have that in place in order for anything you're starting to measure be relevant and comparable to each other. But as for how, it's as you said, it's very much it depends on the business model. I would describe how things are captured here at Clay are very different than some of the other orgs I've been at because Clay is the first business I've been at where I would describe it as being heavily PLG versus a lot of the other orgs I've been at before have been much more outbound focused. So essentially, the emotions there are significantly different. And when it makes sense to create that opportunity, can be a little bit different too because of that. Like here, we kind of base it off of when someone books a meeting.
Yeah. For maybe some businesses out there that are primarily PLG or a mix of product led and sales led, do you all create opportunities for free trials or free members that come in for Clay? Do you only do that for folks that come inbound looking to talk to a sales team? How should people think about that?
So we have it today where there's a large part of our business which is still pretty organic. It's still PLG and it's self-serve. So we're not really tracking those deeply the same way we would the sort of more sales oriented ones. The sales oriented ones are being created upon a booking on one of our reps' calendars.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Daniel, I have a question for you first on this, and then we'll get Albert's take. Kind of goes back. Morgan asked this question. How do you feel about prospecting stage opportunities? So there's no two-way communication and it's hopeful, i.e., they are trying to establish.
I'm incredibly anti, and I think Albert will be aligned, but Albert, maybe you feel differently.
I'm actually somewhere in the indifferent zone of it. Like I'm fine with creating an opportunity in prospecting. And we do have ops in prospecting at almost every org I've been at, but I would describe it as the forecasting category for prospecting is omitted. It is not in the pipeline yet. I don't consider it as real until it actually goes through those checks.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think process wise, there's certainly ways you can do it wrong, but there's also ways that you can do it right. And as long as you've got some of those best practices set up, I think you're okay. Chris was asking specifically what tools and processes do you guys use to automate your forecast versus the pieces that are still human touch, human led? He said they're using Gong for calls, Clary for forecasting, Clary for activity tracking, but it's not great. What have you guys seen work there in terms of automation versus the human aspect in forecasting? What's the tech stack and the process there?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's a combination of a couple of different things. One is we are a RevOps company, so obviously we're using Clay ourselves. We are also leveraging information from Gong, such as the Gong transcripts, and trying to overlay AI to try to boil down some of those pieces to help fill out additional information. aside from that, building out that cadence is that we are customers of Cinch.
Yeah. Yeah.
Waiting for that
All right.
mentioning.
Yeah. All right. And then, so Daniel, I'll start with you. We talked a lot about pipeline analytics. We talked about what falls into the vanity bucket, what falls into the value bucket. We gave some very specific examples of things that people can do, right? Make sure you have documentation for what qualified means, also clear entry and exit criteria for your stages. Make sure that opportunity creation and your setup within your CRM actually aligns with the process and the way that. What are some one or two things that you would leave folks with today, advice that you would give them around vanity versus value and pipeline analytics that they can kind of take away and immediately deploy into their job, say today, or their business today or tomorrow?
I think the big thing is just anytime you're looking at a report or looking at some set of data, try to go 2 or 3 layers deeper of if we're looking at open pipe, you then want to be able to answer what are the deals that make up that open pipe number? What are the reps that own that open pipe number? I think just continuously thinking of it as if you've seen the Daniel Craig movie Layer Cake, you always want to be going kind of like one layer deeper of explaining kind of like what actually are the companies or the opportunities that like make up this data and how we're looking at it. Keeping in mind that like just because you have that extra cut of data, it's not necessarily more informed or better.
Yeah. And what about you, Albert?
I think it's very much what Daniel said. It's essentially based off of what you're seeing in your pipeline and stuff. If you kick the tires a little bit, are there ways to spot just like, hey, there's probably something wrong with it? Or do I actually trust in what I'm looking at? The Gong deal board essentially lets you see things such as activities associated with a opportunity, and essentially I can just go through and point out to a rep or a manager, just like, look, you actually have like 10 deals here, and that supposedly will get you to quota, but 3 of your deals haven't had activities in the last 30 days. How good do you actually feel about this? And I can pretty quickly wipe down a deal board quite a bit if you just look on a pretty high level.
Yeah. And I'd say 2 things for the group. One lines up with what Daniel mentioned before, but and it's what we have on the slide, right? Like more data is not better data. So one, it's really easy to fill, say, a pipeline dashboard with charts and metrics, but more does not mean more valuable. And so to Daniel's point, right, ask those questions. So if you're looking at a KPI or a metric or a chart, if you can't ask those next level questions, then again, there's no reason that you need to be tracking that specific data point. And one of the things that I always like to do is, again, ask myself like, okay, based on what I'm looking at right now, what would I do? Or what will I do based on what the data tells me? And again, if you can't answer that question, then pull it off, right? I know we're kind of all in this mix of like, hey, like want to prove value, right? Look at all this cool stuff that I can measure. Look at all these great data points that we're tracking. But again, business is all about execution and outcomes. And if you're tracking stuff that's not going to lead you to better outcomes, then don't waste your time and focus on stuff that actually matters. All right, guys. Well, with that, we are basically at time. So I've got nothing else for you. Albert and Daniel, thank you guys very much for dropping a whole lot of pipeline knowledge on us today. I really appreciate it. And to all the attendees out there, thank you very much as well. Have a good rest of your Thursday, everybody. I'll see you.
Thanks for having me.